Thanks everyone for joining us. We've got 5 panelists today who have so graciously offered their time to kind of tune in and join us. The first is Brad Johnson. He's the chair and associate professor of environmental studies at Davidson College. He's a geologist and a geomorphologist with areas of expertise kind of including geomorphology, soil development, human impacts on the landscape. And I had the chance to work with him when I was at Davidson. We also have Jeff Rose, who's an assistant professor and lecturer in the Department of Parks and Recreation and Tourism, and an affiliate faculty at the Global Change and Sustainability Center at the University of Utah. And we have, Janita Castro, who is a communications director at Outdoor Afro, which is an organization, really cool nonprofit organization that celebrates and inspires Black connections and leadership in nature. She's also the CEO of Humanity Communications Collective. As a Charlotte resident, she's been vocal about the importance of public lands, has visited the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge mentioned in the film to meet with Indigenous peoples and witness the porcupine caribou migration, and has visited Capitol Hill numerous times in support of public lands and Land Water Conservation Fund. We have Sam Evans with SELC. He's a senior attorney and leader of the Southern Environmental Law Center's National Forests and Parks program. And then we also have Bart Landis, who's the executive director of the Catawba Lands Conservancy. I spoke with him last Friday with our Find Your Summit series, and he has been working in nonprofit for 30 plus years, has lots of experience in that field, and has been a lover of the land and outdoor recreation, especially skiing. So yeah, great panelists, all, well, Jeff's out in Utah, but generally pretty local. And I'm really excited to chat with you guys. So I guess first, I want to go around and briefly ask each of you about if you have any personal connection with any of America's public lands. So obviously the film addressed 3 specific areas, but we're based on the East Coast. Our public lands look very different than the ones in the film. Yeah, and so I want to hear about the places that are relevant to all of you guys personally. So maybe let's start with Brad, just because you're at the top of my screen and we can kind of rotate through.
Yeah, sure. I started my academic career in Idaho of all places, which I think, along with some of the other Intermountain West states, has as much public land as any place else. In fact, I think something like 80% of land in Idaho is public. It includes the Frank Church Wilderness, which is the largest road-free zone in the lower 48 states. And I really just got used to, as a geologist, being able to go wherever I wanted to. And so when I moved to the East Coast, that's a lot more difficult. In fact, I lived in Boone for a few months, and I was always disappointed by the fact that I couldn't go wherever I wanted to. Boone is very privatized. And so nowadays, when I head up to the mountains, I tend to head up towards Linville and Linville Falls area because of the Pisgah National Forest. Whether it's Wilson Creek or Linville Gorge, it's just easier to be able to kind of travel freely and spend more time outside. And I have young kids, and so that's kind of been a priority for ours over the last couple of years, is to make sure that we're spending a fair amount of time outside.
Great. Let's jump to Sam next.
Hey, well, I'm from Alabama and have spent almost all of my life in the South. This is the farthest north in Nashville that I've ever lived. The Southern Appalachians, those are sort of my stomping grounds and where I have the deepest connections. I've been really happy to go out west and spend some time rock climbing in the winds, actually in Bears Ears and at Indian Creek. And I've spent some time in the Frank in Idaho and have loved those trips, but have always been really happy to come home. My favorites are all in the Nantahala, Pisgah, and Cherokee National Forest and the Smokies, sort of the core of the Southern Apps.
Great. Let's do Jeff next.
I was born and raised in North Carolina. I live out in Utah now and have lived and worked in the American West for the last like 15 years of my life. Much of my personal and professional career has been spent on public lands. I'm an outdoor educator. I'm a climbing guide. I'm a professor of outdoor recreation now. And so personal and professional life has been spent on many of the public lands that were documented in the film. And similar to Brad, I have two young kids, and you know, I will say that public lands have taken on a new meaning in recent years as we try to find open space and find wild experiences and spaces to kind of step away from people and cities and in spaces like that.
Great. Let's do Janita. Oop. Can you unmute yourself? There we go.
There we go. Sorry, I thought I hit it. I always like to start with exactly what public lands means. You know, I find that, you know, when I first started getting involved in conservation work, and I was like, well, what is a public land? I didn't know what that was, and it always sounds like some far away place, like a Bears Ears or like the Arctic or those things. And so I always like to remind people first that public land is any land that's managed by any official, right? Federal, state, local. And so for me, the most important public lands are your public parks, things that are close to home, the baseball fields that your kids may play on, the trail you may go running through. And so those are my favorite public lands, the ones that can be easily accessible by anyone, whether you're, you know, in an urban environment or in a rural environment. And just a reminder that these public lands are everywhere and that they do belong to us. And so, you know, Shelton Johnson, park ranger for the National Park Service, always says that public lands are our nation's inheritance. It's what we inherit from this country. And so I have favorite lands. I love Pisgah. I love the Arctic. Most people will never go there. I love Central Park. I'm from New York. But, you know, the public lands that I can walk to and that most people can get to are my most favorite.
I think that's an important point to emphasize, that public lands don't necessarily just mean national parks and wild places. They mean, you know, the baseball field down the street from your house as well. But yeah, Bart, let's finish up with you before we move on to some other questions.
I've got a little bit of an eclectic mix of stuff that relates to several of the things that have already been said. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and had the good fortune in our early years to be half a block from a public park. So that was a nifty trick. But then if you've ever been to Charlottesville, you know it's right at the foothills of the mountains. And so the Blue Ridge was a big part of my youth. And then I had an interesting experience with sort of public lands, because I had a bunch of friends who were cavers. We would go caving and you had to ask permission, but it was generally granted. The folks who owned those caves generally recognized that it was an important thing to have them explored and to have people understand their value and their part of the ecosystem. And so all those things had an effect. And then my children all had this incredible experience with a trip that it was one of those see the United States in 4 weeks kinds of trip. But it was led by a very gifted person who took them almost exclusively to public lands to camp as they went. And so it fairly well told the story of the American Manifest Destiny, but also of the dedication of lands to the public as part of that. So that was a big part of their childhood and part of my sort of understanding of the value of these things, not just to me, but to my whole family.
Great. Well, thank you guys for all kind of giving more of your background on this topic. But next I want to cover kind of a general question before we do some more specific stuff. I guess I'll throw this one to Brad, but if anyone else has anything specific to say about this, please do. What do you feel is at stake if we fail to protect our public lands?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we talk a lot about wildness, and I think, you know, Jeff is an old friend of mine, and so I learned a lot of this from Jeff a long time ago. But you know, what does it mean to be wild, and what does it mean to preserve whole ecosystems? I think we oftentimes do this thing where we separate humans from the ecosystems, right? Like the ecosystems are like the things that don't have humans in them. When we know that that's not true, and it's not true both in urban ecosystems that we see outside our doors here, but also in places with large indigenous populations. I mean, those people have been part of those ecosystems for a really long time. So I think we need to think about that. I'm not answering a clear answer. I'm kind of getting around it a little bit here, but I think we need to think about these questions more holistically. Like, I think it's valuable to save wild places for lots of reasons, but I also think we need to think about what we mean when we say wild places. And so what do we mean when we say preserve this ecosystem? And there's a lot of language like that in the movie. They preserve this ecosystem intact, but they don't really necessarily define what intact means. And a lot of the video that we see in it is like an ecosystem without people in it. But we also need to think about what those ecosystems look like with people in them as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, to kind of, put everything in context when we think about public lands. But yeah, it's not just necessarily the shiny, beautiful vistas that you see in the movie. Great, if anyone else has thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll build off of some of that. One of the things that kind of struck me, maybe similar, but with a little bit of a different twist on it, is the issue of scale that was going on in the film. And I think it gets to some of Janita's points as well, which is we tend to think about entire ecosystems at particular scales. And, they use the number of 640 million pretty regularly, 640 million acres to describe the amount of public lands. And in fact, we know that it's actually more than that. If we take in our urban and suburban parks and peri-urban spaces and things like that, I think they're talking about federal land, which I went ahead and looked that up. That's about the size of Kazakhstan, which would be the 9th largest country in the world if we consider just those public lands as an entity. And so the film tended to focus on those kind of larger scales. Anwar and the Boundary Waters, and even Bears Ears in its fragmented state is still at a fairly large scale. And I think that particular scale lends a particular kind of analysis to it. And if we expand that scale, or if we contract that scale a little bit, then we come into different analyses as well. And that, I think a lot of us, myself included for sure, can fall into the trap of romanticizing these large, wild, supposedly unpeopled landscapes as though, they're kind of the ultimate vision of what humanity can do, which is show some restraint. Right? We can show some restraint, and we can refuse to extract from here, or we can refuse to build a road through this area, or something like that. And I think that's worth thinking about. But again, the scale of analysis, when we think about that, is somewhat limited, because we're erasing populations who've participated in these landscapes in different ways for millions and millions of years. And so I guess maybe to answer your question, Olivia, what's at stake, I think, is an accurate analysis of what's going on. And I do think, as much as I'm critical of kind of these large scale conservation efforts, I'm also appreciative of them. I benefit from them personally, particularly in the state that I live in. Before this, I was just on a Utah State Outdoor Recreation Conference call hosted by Mitt Romney, who was talking about the economic impact of outdoor recreation and preservation of public lands, particularly in this time of coronavirus and COVID-19. And it's a big part of the lifestyle out here. And for me, that means recreationally, but for other folks, that means economically, that means culturally, that means even religiously. And so, I think what's at stake is a sense of our livelihoods, our kind of sense of self and our sense of place within this larger environment.
Great, you kind of touched on this question, but I want to build off of what you just said about the economics of all this. Many economies throughout the United States are dependent on public lands, like Minnesota's Boundary Waters, as seen in the film. How would you compare the economic success generated from maintaining public lands for public use with the profit that can be gained through privatization and energy extraction? And why would it be good to advocate for one over the other?
So I'll go ahead and start. I think my first question though is profit for who? Who's who's making the money off these things, and the extraction, where is the extraction coming from? The history has showed us that extraction usually comes from the most marginalized communities, the most vulnerable communities. The people who are impacted by climate change are usually the poorest in our country, right? So we really need to think about where that profit is going and who it's benefiting. The other thing is that there is an ability to coexist, and this is, I think, maybe what Jeff and Brad had begun to do before, is that there are pristine wild places, and I've been there and I believe in them, and I think they're important to the ecosystem of animals, people included. But there's also ability to coexist. So when I think about out west, when I think about LA and the Santa Monica Mountains and the mountain lions that live in the Santa Monica Mountains, and you have a mountain lion P22 that lives in Griffith Park, which is a very populated place. He lives within 8 square miles, and he coexists with the people of LA. And LA in the middle of building, the National Wildlife Federation is in the middle of building the largest wildlife crossing on the planet, with an $85 million wildlife crossing over the 101. Right? So these animals can coexist in the land that they were on first, and people can live there as well. So it's not an either or. There's a lot of and but that we can do that doesn't destroy communities, that doesn't destroy habitats, but also lives in a place where we can talk about coexisting in a way that works for everyone, and wildlife included.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's, the coexistence idea has been something that's kind of been absent from the conversation, for a long time, and I'm glad that it's being brought into the conversation now. Bart?
Olivia, can I add a couple things?
Yeah, please.
The prior 2 questions. We're a small land trust in an rapidly urbanizing area around Charlotte, North Carolina, and so don't have anything like the scale of the stuff that was discussed in the movie. But when we do our preservation, we talk a lot about economic development, but also about health. In that rapidly urbanizing environment, being able to be outdoors someplace where you will not be run over is actually a really, really important thing, and not that common. And that's one of the things that we find to be most important about it, is literally a place to play, and a place to enjoy the flora and the fauna, and to do something other than urban kinds of things. It's also educational for kids. It's also a big economic driver in many ways, because the recreation is a useful thing, but also because better health is better economy. So we go heavy on the health side of things, and also on relatively smaller pieces of property that we think are really, really important to our efforts.
Great. I want to focus a little bit kind of more regionally, because this movie touches on a lot of stuff that's going on the Western public lands, but obviously we're not located anywhere near any of that. So there's kind of an inherent tension between the Trump administration's energy dominance policy that it's kind of the idea increasing energy and fossil fuel extraction in the US in hopes of reducing dependence on foreign energy sources, and the value brought to public lands from protection of lands and waters. How can we best navigate the tension between extraction, protecting public lands, and what solutions would enable a better energy future for the nation without sacrificing the value brought by our public land? So I'm kind of thinking like regionally, pipeline stuff, offshore drilling in North Carolina, that sort of thing. I don't know, Sam, if you work on any of this or have thoughts on this, but if anyone has thoughts, please chime in.
Yeah, I'll be happy to get us started. You know, I guess where I would start is to think about the intersection between energy, climate, and public lands. You know, obviously, our public lands in the East are very different than the West, and have a incredible potential for carbon storage. They are also really valuable as productive forests for timber harvest. We're fairly lucky that most of our large tracts of public land are not underlain by substantial oil and gas deposits, although some of them certainly are in the region. And you know, you'll see a very different development pattern on the public lands that have that, you know, that resource curse of having oil and gas underneath. But you know, largely in the Southern Alps, and I'm sure we could get a geological explanation on this from Brad. We have less of that, and so we have, you know, less to worry about on that front. Certainly, you know, the Daniel Boone National Forest is a great example of a place where there's sort of historical and current gas drilling, and the Allegheny is another national forest in the east that has just incredibly high density of that kind of energy development. You know, recently, one of the biggest threats from bad energy policy that we've had to our region, though, was pipeline development, and that's going to continue to be a threat in our region. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline, both sort of bisecting important tracts of public lands in Virginia and West Virginia. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline recently canceled, of course, but I could go on about sort of current threats. I mean, one of the questions raised in the film is about transfer of federal lands to state lands as sort of a stepping stone to privatization. You know, a lot of people ask me if that's something to worry about in the East, and largely there hasn't been as much of a push for that in the East. I think the reason may be that people who really care about public lands from both sides of the political fence are living in the same communities with each other more so than they are out west, and there tends to be a little bit less political push-pull. But for whatever reason, we've been a little bit immune to that. You know, there's been some worry with things like the Chattahoochee Land Adjustment Act, that was a stepping stone. There was some worry that, you know, federal national forest land was going to be transferred, and it was eventually going to become a landfill, a municipal landfill. But you know, those are sort of exceptions that prove the rule. Our biggest threats to public lands are in sort of changing the definition of what public ownership of public lands means. You know, it's always in the past, it's meant democratic sort of accountability for land management decisions. And you know, from my seat, that's the biggest thing under threat right now in our region.
Any other thoughts on that from anyone else?
Maybe I'll echo a couple of things Sam said there, and maybe expand this into a national issue just a little bit. I didn't think the film went too deeply into Bears Ears and that area and its management strategy, which is quite frankly revolutionary in the history of the United States. You know, land as this country was being colonized was basically set aside for disposal. That's how it's written into the Constitution, and that's how it was managed for. Well, I mean, it's still managed today. I just listened to Mitt Romney talk about how do we dispose of our public lands, and that's a particular ideology that's associated with it. The proposal for Bears Ears and the very brief management of Bears Ears while it was a national monument was nothing short of revolutionary, in that it had 5 tribes that were contributing to the management of it in consultation with the Bureau of Land Management under the Department of the Interior, which is a cabinet level position that changes political administrations every 4 to 8 years. And so I think what Bears Ears, for that brief time that there was a thing called Bears Ears National Monument, illustrated something like what Sam was getting at, which is this could have national policy implications and align itself with existing institutional frameworks, while also being heavily influenced and heavily managed by local, and in this case, indigenous policymakers. And so you had these tribes not only involved in like an advisory capacity, which many national parks, national forests, and things like that have advisory committees of local groups and things like that, but actually having the local groups manage it. And then I think one of the things that we see with more kind of epistemologies that are associated with indigenous groups is a vision towards the future. I think many of us have a vision towards right now. I think earlier you mentioned, like, or maybe Janita might have mentioned, what is, the profit for whom? And I would say the profit for when. And often that time frame for profit is extremely narrow, everything from, like, I don't know, 10 years to the next quarter or something like that. And so I think one of the things that when we get indigenous management in there, we start to think more long term. We start to think about this over in terms of generations, as opposed to kind of like what the current administration is or something like that. And so I think the Bears Ears management strategy that was laid out under Sally Jewell and the Obama administration offers us a template for what this could look like in the future.
I would echo Jeff's emphasis on time frames, time spans. One of the things that's interesting to me about the last really 100, 150 years is the expectation that we will always use coal and we will always use oil. And it's already started to change. We've seen glimmers of that already. One of our great supporters has this whole speech he does about we already live in the post-carbon economy. So some of the extraction stuff may be periodic. And that probably relates to coal for sure, oil a little bit less, gas a little bit less. But then you've also got extraction of minerals and things like that. And one of the examples in the film was about a spill of really toxic material from either silver or gold mine, I can't remember which. So, getting past this carbon stuff doesn't resolve all those questions, but it does take some of the pressure off. And my concern for all of our policymakers is, to Jeff's point, they only think about right now. But there's this huge sea change staring us in the face, and they're not doing anything about that. They're not thinking about it at all. No policy related to that.
Sam, did you have a response to that? I just saw you moving. Okay, I have a question about this, kind of within the time frames thing. In the movie, after 80 years of advocacy work, Bears Ears National Monument was finally established at the end of the Obama administration in 2016. And in the film, the Navajo and Hopi filmmaker Angelo Baca remarked, a place that was important to us suddenly seemed to matter to everyone else. But then I'm curious, because I know it really struck me, how did you feel when shortly after in the film, the Trump administration's rollback of this designation was shown, along with a long list of other environmental and public lands protections being removed? And what's your response to that? And how can people that maybe aren't as heavily involved in public land protections now get involved and have their voices heard? So, Janita, maybe, or anyone?
Yeah, let's. I'm going to be clear on this. Those rollbacks were the action of an egotistical megalomaniac. Okay, someone who wanted to come in and undo everything that the previous administration done for no other reason than that he could. So, like, I want to be very clear on where I stand there. So, had you feel obviously angry and just annoyed and frustrated with that and lots of other things. So what people can do is vote. Please vote. Get involved locally. There's national, federal stuff, yes, but a lot of the stuff, as you talked about earlier, is close to home. Things that are happening in Charlotte or right in Utah or wherever you live or where you're from. So those are things that we all have to do and can do at any age. you know, I look at the climate justice movement, and I look at the Gen Z and younger who are coming in unapologetically fighting for what they believe in. And so we can all still do that, even in all our older, wiser years, is really still have that fire to do that, and vote for the things that are really important. So, you know, again, that whole, we talk about land grabs, like that was a, in my mind, that was a very specific land grab that the administration was trying to make to prove power.
I'll just add to that my feeling, similar to probably some other folks here, was, I mean, it's almost comical if you can separate yourself from the kind of hurt and the environmental destruction that's associated with it. It was so naked. It's almost like watching these parodies of Saturday Night Live, where like the parody doesn't make sense anymore because it's so close to reality. And so, you know, this kind of naked, I mean, just kind of anything that Obama did needs to be destroyed or dismantled or undermined in some way. And I guess I am both very sympathetic to the idea of like acting locally and getting involved locally and voting locally. And I would say that, you know, Bears Ears is yours. In suburban Charlotte, it's for you. And in Miami and New York and Iowa, you know, ANWR is for you. It's for us. That's our collective heritage. And I would not limit this to a nationalist perspective. Like these are global sites of importance. And so while I very much appreciate the idea that we should be involved locally and on local issues and local concerns and things of that nature, like there's no problem whatsoever with people from North Carolina demanding that their senators and their representatives fight for public lands in Alaska and Minnesota and Utah and North Carolina. So I would, I think we can do both, and we should be doing both.
I'd just like to follow up on Jania's point about how political pressure matters. The same administration that rolled back Bears Ears just pushed through the Great American Outdoors Act. And it was because it was politically expedient. So make things politically expedient for people.
Yeah, I was going to mention that recent enactment too. And you know, a year ago or so, maybe a little bit more, the Tennessee Wilderness Act was passed. I guess a little over a year and a half ago, protecting 20,000 acres of the Cherokee National Forest as wilderness forever. And in the current political climate, you would not have expected some of these things for good things for public lands to happen. Those happen through the legislative process, which you know, there's, I would say at this point, a little more, at least, accountability to the public than there is from the executive branch. You know, the one thing that I would say that is positive, a silver lining about some of these bad public lands decisions and rollbacks, is that people have noticed, you know, that it matters to people. And, you know, that's something that I would like us to bring home to our region more. It's not just Bears Ears that it's under threat. It's not just ANWR that's under threat. The whole concept of public lands is under threat from this administration. You know, Catherine Newfont wrote a book called The Blue Ridge Commons. If other panelists may be familiar with it, I think it is probably the best, you know, sort of unified theory of what public lands mean in Western North Carolina, at least. And you know, it explains, you know, people's sometimes resistance to wilderness. It also explains those same people's resistance to development of those public lands. It's those are efforts by outsiders to fence off common property. And so, you know, I think there's a really strong thread of a feeling of public ownership here. I think, you know, I think of my job somewhat as building that relationship. And instead of just sort of protecting public lands from immediate threats, which is definitely easy trap to fall into, but building that relationship requires thinking about equitable access to public lands and, you know, fostering a sense of ownership through ensuring that democratic accountability is always available for public land management. And that includes defending things like the NEPA process and accountability through FOIA. Some of these basic good governance laws that allow us to participate in how these places are managed.
If I could add something
Yeah,
there,
please.
and Jeff, when you said Saturday Night Live, I just for so many years, I'm like, is that an Onion article? Did I just read that headline? Like, is that what I'm reading? And then it's like, it's actually CNN, and it makes me nuts. But you know, one of the things, and I agree with Jeff and Sam, what you said about, you know, that those lands belong to all of us, right? Theirs belongs to us in Florida and New York and those places. And I think one of the things that Outdoor Afro does really well is connecting people to public lands that are close to them, right? And so there's an idea that you can just scaffold up, right? Like you start with what you know. Like if somebody told, you know, me 10 years ago that the park next door was going to be torn down for apartment buildings or whatnot, that's something I probably would go fight for because it's going to affect me directly. And as I learn about that, then maybe I learn about stuff that's more regional based, right? So it's 2 hours to Pisgah. Love Pisgah. If that was going to be under threat, then I would go work on that, right? And then you start to understand that the approach can have, you can do local, but then also care about the things that are far away. It's very hard for people to care about the Arctic when they're probably never, ever going to go there. But what we try to do, and what I try to do, is make sure that you show the thread between the Arctic and the bird in your backyard that migrated from the Arctic over the wintertime or whatever it is, right? So, and so with Outdoor Afro, connecting people to lands near them then gets them to care about lands further away from that. And so the political pressure that was mentioned was part of what the Great American Outdoors Act, but the Land Water Conservation Fund was about. So when Outdoor Afro went to Capitol Hill as constituents and met with different representatives to talk about, yes, Black people care about LWCF, but we also have to explain what that means. That means bike lanes. That means, you know, hiking trails near my house, right? And so when we can bring a group of people together, galvanize around something that is for the greater good, but affects them on a day-to-day basis, that's when we can apply pressure, and we can then continue to scaffold up on the bigger pieces of legislation that then roll up to what the success we saw with the Great American Outdoors Act.
And I'll just say that what Janita just said there is supported by social science, which basically has spent quite a bit of time establishing that experiences, and particularly experiences in your developmental stages as a young person, have substantial impacts on your conservation-related behavior as an adult. And so I think local, experiential, visceral, hands-on experiences as young people is vital if we want to do something like support broad conservation and, you know, kind of, you know, everything from fighting climate change to making sure that we have intact ecosystems. I mean, I think all of those things are connected, and I think there are things that all of us can do at a very, very local level to support those processes.
Janita, I have a question for you with your work with Outdoor Afro, although anyone can chime in on this. I was listening to Michelle Obama's new podcast the other day, and she was discussing kind of the current moment, but also the greater social movement we're currently living through and fighting for. And she said some people have been quarantining for their entire lives, meaning they just never had the access to some of these wilder spaces. And the film highlights the necessity of protecting these public lands for the benefit of everyone. The whole point is public lands should be for everyone. And it starts to touch on the intersectionality of the greater environmental movement. How do you see the fight for public lands and public protections and the fight for more general social equality for Black, Indigenous, people of color as being intertwined?
Yeah, so we have to remember that none of this is mutually exclusive, right? Environmental justice, racial justice, social justice, gender justice, all these intersectionalities are inextricably linked, right? Can't have one without the other. We also know that Black folks and other people of color are disproportionately affected at the effects of climate change and justice. Now, if we think about the movement that we're in, and we're thinking about, you know, George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, we can think about Christian Cooper, who was birding in Central Park, and all those things. They were not safe in the outdoors, right? So Outdoor Afro really believes that Black people have the right to be strong, beautiful, and free in the outdoors. And we know that's not true. We know that if a man can go running and get chased and shot and killed for being Black, we know that a very experienced birder can be in Central Park and be targeted because of the color of his skin. And these are things that we have known for a very, very long time. They're just caught on tape now, right? So these are historical things we know about. We know that, you know, living in the Jim Crow South, you were not allowed to swim in public beaches. You were not allowed to go into pools, right? So now we have a history of people that can't, people that were not allowed to swim, and Black children die at 5.5 times the rate of their white counterparts because of drowning. Right, so we have to always remember that this is not just 2020. This is, you know, 1920. This is 1820. This is 1720. This goes back a very long time. And so, having the ability to be safe outdoors is a privilege, and it's a luxury not afforded to everyone. And it's part of our job at Outdoor Afro to give people a space where they can come together with people that look like them and have experiences like them and enjoy the outdoors in a way where they're not looking over their shoulder, wondering what's coming behind them or who's going to say something nasty to them because they're on a trail. And it's our job as people, all of us as people who are in environmental conversations, in conservation conversations, to recognize that and to talk about it, so there becomes systemic change that needs to happen.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I mean, I think that cultural piece is a huge piece of this that we missed when we just talk about conserving land. There's a well-known piece written, I think, 4 or 5 years ago called "Birding While Black." That's even more at home than Central Park, right? Because it's written by a Clemson professor, and he's doing these birding transects up and down the Blue Ridge. And he talks about having, you know, you have to stand in one place for 3 minutes and count every bird you see in 3 minutes, and standing in front of a house with a Confederate flag for 3 minutes. And, you know, it's like the time can't go fast enough for him. And, you know, I see similar things even after the Black Lives Matter movement, where if you're on the Wilson Creek Facebook page, which, you know, it's a good place for knowing which roads are open and closed in Wilson Creek, as people use that place recreationally, whoever the poor people who moderate that site are constantly banning people, because when Latinx people show up to use public lands, Wilson Creek is as public as a public land gets. You know, those people are harassed, and so we see these societal and cultural problems in these lands that go far beyond, you know, who can technically show up and enjoy themselves on any given day.
Yeah, great. After watching the film, it's easy to be fired up about activism, and I just wanted to highlight that, you know, it should be an intersectional type of activism. So great. That kind of wraps up any of my questions that I had for you guys, but I kind of want to give everyone a minute to add any additional notes that they might have as we wrap up, if anyone has anything they want to add.
I just wanted to share something that I went to bed last night feeling a little bit down after watching that video, even though the landscapes are pretty to look at and things like that. A little piece of optimism. Just announced it's about 2:40 Mountain Time, so 4:40 your time on I guess Wednesday, August 12th, and the federal government just announced that some Bureau of Land Management leasing parcels that were directly adjacent to Arches National Park and Canyonlands National Park are not going to go up for sale. And so that's big news here in the state of Utah. But I think, again, I think a couple folks have made the point today that that action works, direct action works, making phone calls works. And I'm increasingly convinced that that my greatest contribution is not making phone calls, but it's using whatever platform I have. And I'm a professor, and so I have students, and try to communicate that way, and then professional networks and things like that. But trying to get other people to make phone calls, because if I make a phone call, that's one, and that's great. But if I have 50 students, then you know, there's 50 phone calls that are potentially there. And so I guess these things do work. They have worked in the past. They will work in the future. And so I encourage folks to do that locally, nationally, internationally, so on and so forth.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing great news, Jeff. It's nice to, it's nice to have some positivity. I'll close out my portion by saying that you know, Outdoor Effort has 90 volunteer leaders in 30 states, so there's more than likely a community near you that you can get with. We you know, appreciate all people who want to come and connect with our community, and just knowing that when you come to an Outdoor Effort event, you know, blackness is centered, and that's the lens that we see things through, and that we believe in. But always welcome people to come. There's a very active group in Charlotte. I started the Charlotte community 3 or 4 years ago, and now there's, I think, 3 leaders. There's leaders in Raleigh, there's Utah, Colorado. I mean, they're all over the country, and the events are amazing. Biking, hiking, fishing, swimming. I mean, all sorts of just wonderful things. And would encourage any of you that this wonderful panel, or anyone watching, to go to outdooreffort.com and see if there's a meetup near you, and go out and enjoy the lands that, you know, that belong to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Again, as it was touched on kind of throughout the conversation today, this is both a local and a national movement protecting public lands. So to find out more about how you can get involved in your local communities as well as the national stage, you can visit the Patagonia Action Works Public Lands page. Just Google it. I'll also post the link in our Instagram bio after this. And you can put in your zip code, and they'll give you a bunch of different local organizations, or they'll show like a ton of different national like petitions, etc., ways you can get involved nationally. You can also text DEFEND, all capitals, to 7133, which is also Patagonia's Action Works, and they'll send you updates for your local community about things going on, as well as stuff on the national stage. And so again, I'll post all of this stuff, and then also I'll post a link to a list of print resources. Patagonia has shared like a great reading list to learn more about public lands and conservation more generally. Yeah, and then the final point I want to make is the reason I kind of worked to put together this event was that I feel strongly about conservation, and the biggest way to get involved is to share your voice. So talk to your friends, share the movie, talk about what's going on around you, and then also vote is the biggest thing. I'm going to post the link to head count. If anyone isn't registered to vote, please register ASAP ahead of the November elections, and definitely show up. That's the biggest way to make a difference. As we kind of highlighted, there's been a lot of, you know, Sam mentioned the Tennessee stuff that was going on. Yeah, work with your local legislators. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me, everyone. I think this conversation was great, and I'm excited to share it on our YouTube channel and promote it further afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Thank you all.